The mud of Ash Valley was a greedy thing. It sucked at Elias McKenna's patched boots with every step. A cold, wet kiss that promised to drag him down and keep him. He was on foot because the last of the bandits who'd tried to rob the Miller family had put a bullet in his mare, Bess, and he'd had to leave her under a pile of stones just south of the pass. He'd gotten the Millers through, their wagon and their 2 small children safe. But the cost had been the last warm-blooded creature that knew the sound of his voice. He walked into town with their $10 in his pocket, a worn gun belt on his hips, and a weariness that had sunk clear into his marrow. Winter had been long and cruel, and the thaw had turned the world to muck and misery. Ash Valley looked like it had been clawed out of the mountainside by a desperate animal. Raw timber buildings lined a single, wide street that was more river than road. The ceaseless, thunderous roar of a distant stamp mill was the town's heartbeat, a frantic rhythm of gold fever and crushing rock. The air smelled of pine sap, coal smoke, and something sour, like spilled whiskey and regret. Men with hollowed-out eyes and mud-caked trousers watched him pass, their gazes lingering on the Colt peacemaker at his side before dismissing him. A man on foot was a man with nothing to lose and nothing to take. He was invisible. His first stop was the sheriff's office. A man needed to know the lay of the land, and the lawman's chair was often the highest point from which to see it. The man behind the desk, Sheriff Brody, had a gut that strained the buttons of his vest and a face flushed with the kind of good living a lawman's salary couldn't buy. A gold watch chain was draped across his middle like a victory banner. Elias kept his hat in his hands. "Afternoon, Sheriff. Just passing through. Wondered if there was any work for a man with a strong back." Sheriff Brody leaned back, his chair groaning in protest. He sized Elias up with lazy, dismissive eyes. "Work's plentiful if you don't mind a pickaxe. The Consolidated Mine is always hiring, but you don't look like a miner." "Used to be a stockman," Elias said, the words tasting like ash. "Lost my horse." "Unfortunate," the sheriff said, with no hint of sympathy. He gestured vaguely toward the window. "Town's a bit agitated right now. Miners think they're not getting their fair share. Stirring up trouble. Best to keep your head down." Elias's gaze drifted past the sheriff to the far wall, where a notice board was covered in claim deeds and company ordinances. There was no list of wanted men. In a town this raw, that meant one of 2 things. Either it was the most peaceful place in the territory, or the law didn't bother chasing criminals who had enough money to pay their way clear. Seeing the sheriff's watch and the bottle of expensive bourbon on his credenza, Elias knew which it was. The fear in this town wasn't of outlaws. It was of the men who owned the law itself. "I appreciate the counsel, Sheriff," Elias said, turning to leave. "Drifter," Brody called out as Elias reached the door. "This town's got rules. Best you learn 'em quick. Rafe Conrad runs the Lucky Ribbon Saloon. He runs a lot of other things, too. Stay on his good side." It wasn't advice. It was a warning. Elias just nodded and stepped back into the mud. The warning confirmed what his gut had already told him. Ash Valley was a place where justice was a commodity, and he was a man with empty pockets. By the time evening bled purple and orange across the jagged peaks, a gnawing hunger drove him toward the brightest light on the street. The Lucky Ribbon Saloon spilled a tinny piano tune and yellow lamplight into the dusk. Pushing through the swinging doors was like stepping into a different kind of storm. The air was thick with the fog of cheap cigars and the smell of unwashed bodies, stale beer, and the cloying sweetness of perfume. It was a symphony of desperation. Miners, gaunt and grim-faced, slammed their glasses on the bar, their laughter too loud, too sharp. Elias found a small, shadowed table in the corner, a place where he could watch the room without being part of it. He ordered a beer and a plate of beans, nursing the drink to make it last. He had no interest in the cards, the liquor, or the women. He was just a ghost at the feast, waiting for the sun to rise so he could find a day's work, earn enough for a horse, and leave this town and its rot behind him. Then he saw her. She was on a small, makeshift stage at the far end of the room, a splash of worn crimson in the smoky haze. She wasn't beautiful in the way of the pristine women in magazines, the kind with soft hands and softer lives. Her face was fine-boned, but etched with a hardness that hadn't been born there. Her hair, a dark river of chestnut, was pinned up in a way that was probably meant to look elegant, but was coming loose with the energy of her movements. She danced, but there was no joy in it. Her body moved with a practiced grace, a fluid motion that told a story of countless nights on countless stages just like this one. But her eyes were a world away. They were a deep, stormy gray, and they held a defiant emptiness that chilled him more than the winter wind. She looked out at the sea of leering faces and saw nothing. She was a woman surviving, not living. The piano player hammered out a clumsy tune, and the miners stomped and hollered. A few tossed coins onto the stage. She bent to pick one up, the crimson fabric of her dress pulling taut across her hips. Every man in the room watched, their eyes crawling over her like insects. Every man but one. At his corner table, Elias turned his head. He looked at the water stains on the wall, at the dregs in his glass, at the scarred knuckles of his own hands. He would not add his eyes to the weight she was already carrying. It was a small thing, a meaningless gesture in a world of casual cruelty. But it was all he had. It was the only coin he possessed. His code was a simple, brutal thing, forged in the fire of a failure he could never outrun. He did not look at women in a way that made them feel trapped. He did not touch without permission. He did not stand by while the strong preyed on the weak. It was a code that had cost him everything and earned him nothing but a profound and unending loneliness. Josie Granger felt the shift in the room's attention like a change in air pressure. When she bent, she could feel the collective gaze of the miners land on her like a physical weight, hot and heavy. It was part of the job, the silent transaction. She showed them a glimpse of skin, and they threw a few more cents her way. She had learned to wall off a part of herself, to let their eyes wash over her form while her mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere safe and quiet. But tonight, one pair of eyes was missing. She had noticed him when he'd walked in. He wasn't a miner, not with those shoulders and the easy way he wore his gun. He was a drifter, road-worn and quiet, with a sadness in his posture that she recognized because she saw a version of it in her own reflection. He had found the darkest corner of the room, as if trying to apologize for taking up space, and now, at the precise moment every other man was devouring her with his eyes. He looked away. It was such a strange, jarring thing. It wasn't disgust. It wasn't indifference. It was deliberate. A turning away that felt more like a courtesy than an insult. It pricked at the thick scar tissue around her heart. For a dizzying second, she felt seen by not being seen at all. The piano music ended, and she curtsied to the scattered applause, her eyes searching for the man in the corner. He was looking down at his hands, his face a mask of stone. He was a puzzle, and Josie had long ago lost her taste for them. Puzzles led to hope, and hope was a fool's game. Later, the crowd thinned as men stumbled out into the night or headed for the card tables in the back. Josie was wiping down glasses behind the bar, the damp rag a poor excuse for the cleansing she truly craved, when a shadow fell over her. "You're looking tired, Josie," Rafe Conrad said. His voice was smooth as polished wood, and just as hard. He was a handsome man, always dressed in a fine black suit that remained miraculously clean in the filth of Ash Valley. But his smile never reached his cold, black eyes. He owned the lucky ribbon, and he owned her. "It's been a long night," she said, not looking at him. He reached out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist. His touch was light, but his grip was steel. "Not yet, it isn't. Mr. Abernathy and his friends are in my office. They requested some private company to help them with their cards." Josie's stomach tightened. Abernathy was a fat, sweating pig of a man who owned a stake in the mine. His hands were always damp, and they wandered. "I've danced my sets. Rafe, my throat is raw from the smoke." Rafe's smile tightened. He leaned closer, his voice a venomous whisper. "Your dead husband, a man of exquisite taste and terrible luck, valued you at $500. That was the price of the wedding dress he couldn't afford and the ring he gambled away. You've worked off 112, until the rest is paid. Your throat, your feet, and your private company belong to me. Do you understand?" The shame was a familiar fire, burning in her cheeks. She was property, a debt on a ledger. She pulled her wrist away, but his grip only tightened. "Let go of me." "That ain't your decision to make." "I believe the lady asked you to let her go." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the saloon's noise like a razor. It came from the shadows. The drifter. Elias McKenna had risen from his table and was standing a few feet away. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved toward his gun. He just stood there, his presence a sudden, unmovable obstacle. Rafe Conrad turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. He looked Elias up and down, taking in the patched boots and worn clothes, and he smiled a predator's smile. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. A hero. This is a private conversation. Friend, I suggest you go find another table to haunt." "It stopped being private when you put your hands on her," Elias said, his voice still level, still calm, but there was something dangerous coiled beneath the surface of that calm, a stillness that promised violence. Rafe, to his credit, seemed to sense it. He released Josie's wrist, leaving red marks on her skin. He straightened his waistcoat, never taking his eyes off Elias. "She works for me. She has a debt to pay. That's business. It doesn't concern you." "What does she owe?" Elias asked. The question hung in the air. Josie stared at him, bewildered. Rafe laughed, a short, ugly bark. "More than you've seen in your entire life. Drifter." "How much?" Elias repeated. $388, Josie said, her voice flat. She didn't know why she answered. Maybe to show this stranger the absurdity of his question, the hopelessness of her situation. Elias's gaze met hers for the first time. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they held a sorrow so profound it made her breath catch. He looked at her not as a saloon girl, not as a piece of property, but as a person, and he looked at her with a terrible, unbearable pity. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled $10 bill the Millers had given him. He placed it on the bar. "That's for her," he said to Rafe. "It's a start. Let her be for the night." The sheer, foolish gall of it was breathtaking. Rafe stared at the bill and then at Elias, his face a mask of contemptuous disbelief. He was about to speak, to order his men to throw this ragged fool out into the mud. But Josie spoke first. Her laughter was a broken, bitter sound. It cut Elias deeper than any blade. He had offered the only thing he had, a gesture of decency in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. And she was laughing at him. "A start?" she said, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce anger. She looked from the $10 bill to Elias's pitying face, and something inside her snapped. She would not be his charity case. She would not be the stray dog he fed from the goodness of his heart. "Don't you dare," she whispered, her voice shaking with a rage that was mostly aimed at herself. "Don't rescue me like I'm someone worth rescuing." She turned on her heel and walked away from both of them, pushing past the bar and heading toward Rafe's office in the back. She didn't look back. She left Elias standing alone at the bar, the $10 bill lying on the polished wood like a withered leaf. He looked less like a hero than a man who'd just been shot. Hours later, Elias sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress in the small, cold cabin he'd rented at the edge of town. He hadn't touched the lamp. Moonlight, thin and watery, filtered through the single dirty window. Her words echoed in the silence. "Don't rescue me like I'm someone worth rescuing." It was the voice of his own failure. the ghost of his sister, Ellie, whispering the words he'd been telling himself for 10 years. He'd failed to save her from the men who had hurt her, powerful men shielded by money and influence. He had been too young, too weak, and now he was a man chasing that failure across the country, trying to atone for a sin that wasn't his by saving people who didn't want his help. A soft, hesitant knock came at the door. He frowned. No one knew he was here. He stood, his hand resting instinctively on the handle of his Colt, and moved to the door. He opened it a crack. It was her, Josie! She stood on his doorstep, a dark, thin cloak wrapped around her hair down and falling over her shoulders. The wind whipped a few strands across her face. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of defiance and desperation. She didn't speak. She just looked at him, her gray eyes asking a question he didn't understand. He stepped back, opening the door wider. She slipped inside, bringing the chill of the night with her. She stood in the center of the small room, a silhouette against the moonlit window. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He saw the resolve harden in her face. It was a terrible, final kind of courage. Before he could speak, before he could ask what she wanted, she reached up and untied the cloak. It fell away, pooling at her feet like a spill of ink. Beneath it, she wore the crimson saloon dress. Her hands went to the laces at her back, her fingers moving with a numb, clumsy efficiency. She turned her back to him, a silent, damning invitation. Then, with a soft whisper of fabric, the dress fell. It slid down her body and joined the cloak on the floor, leaving her standing in the moonlight in nothing but a thin chemise. Her skin seemed to glow, pale and vulnerable. He saw the sharp line of her spine, the delicate curve of her shoulders, and the faint, ugly map of bruises marring the skin just above her waist. His breath caught in his throat. A raw, primal heat flared through him, sharp and unwanted, a purely male reaction that filled him with an immediate and vicious self-loathing. He was no better than the men in the saloon, but tangled with the desire was a profound, aching sorrow. This was her last coin. Her body was the only thing she had left to bargain with, and she was offering it to him as payment for his pity, or perhaps as a test to prove he was just like all the rest. He could smell her skin, a faint scent of soap and sorrow. He could take a single step and close his hands around her waist. The thought was both a temptation and a sacrilege. In that instant, he saw not Josie Granger, but Ellie. He saw every woman who had ever been cornered, used and broken by a world that saw them as objects to be owned. To touch her now would be to become one of them. It would be the final, unforgivable failure. With an effort of will that felt like it was tearing him apart, Elias McKenna turned his back. He faced the cold wall of the cabin, his fists clenched at his sides, the knuckles white. The muscles in his back were a rigid wall of stone. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the image of her bruised skin was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. "Put this on," he said. His voice was a choked, ragged thing, a sound scraped from the depths of his soul. He reached for the long, heavy wool coat that lay on the foot of his bed. Without looking, he held it out behind him. The gesture was stiff, unnatural. The coat was old and smelled of trail dust, wood smoke, and horse. It was all he had to offer. It was warmth. It was cover. It was a shield. For a long moment, there was only the sound of his own ragged breathing and the sigh of the wind outside. Then, he felt the weight of the coat being lifted from his hand. He heard the soft rustle of wool as she wrapped it around herself. He heard her soft footsteps, the creak of the door opening, and the click of the latch as it closed behind her. She was gone. Elias did not move. He stood with his back to the door, facing the wall. For a long time, the cabin was colder, emptier than before. She hadn't made a sound. She hadn't wept or spoken a word. Her pride was a fortress, and he had not breached it. He had only, perhaps, given her a stone to help shore up its walls. Only when he was certain she was long gone, swallowed by the night, did he finally let go. A tremor ran through him, a deep, shuddering quake that started in his chest and shook his entire body. He stumbled to the single chair and collapsed into it, burying his face in his hands. And in the silent, lonely dark of the cabin, Elias McKenna wept. The tears were hot and bitter, a flood of grief for his sister, for the woman who had just left, and for the man his own rigid code would never let him be. Josie returned the coat the next morning. She left it folded neatly on the porch of his small cabin before the sun had fully risen. A silent return of a kindness she didn't know how to accept. She went back to the Lucky Ribbon Saloon that night, and the night after that, she danced with the same hollow defiance, collected her coins, and endured Rafe Conrad's cold, possessive gaze. An invisible wall now stood between her and the quiet man in the corner. He still watched the room, but his eyes never lingered on the stage. He would drink his one beer, eat his plate of beans, and leave. They existed in the same smoky space, two ghosts circling each other, bound by a moment of shame and a gesture of inexplicable decency. Elias found work at the livery, mucking out stalls and repairing harnesses. The pay was meager, but it was honest, and the simple, physical labor kept his mind from wandering too far down dark trails. He told himself he was staying only long enough to earn the price of a decent horse, but the days bled into a week, and then another. He learned Josie's routine. She lived in a small room in a boarding house at the poorer end of town, a place with thin walls and a door that didn't quite shut right. One afternoon, while she was at the saloon, Elias walked to her boarding house carrying a small toolbox. The hinge on her door was loose, the wood around it splintered. It wouldn't hold against a determined shove. With quiet efficiency, he removed the old hinge, plugged the holes with slivers of wood, and refastened it, adding a longer screw to bite into fresh timber. He tested it. The door now closed with a solid, satisfying thud. He was gone before anyone saw him. A few days later, as Josie was leaving the saloon after a long night, her feet aching and her soul numb, she found her small satchel felt heavier than usual. Inside, tucked beneath her spare shawl, was a small loaf of fresh bread and a wedge of hard cheese wrapped in wax paper. She stopped in the middle of the muddy street, her heart giving a painful lurch. There was no note. There was no explanation. There was only the scent of baked bread in the cold night air, a scent so wholesome and out of place in her life that it almost brought her to tears. He became a silent, watchful presence. One night, a hulking miner, flush with a lucky streak at the faro table and emboldened by cheap whiskey, cornered her by the bar. He grabbed her arm, his thick fingers digging into her flesh, his breath sour. "Come on, Josie. A pretty little thing like you shouldn't be so standoffish. Let's have a real drink." Josie tried to pull away, her standard, weary refusal on her lips. But the man's grip was like iron, just as a familiar spike of fear pierced her numbness. The miner's eyes widened, his grip slackened. Behind him, Elias McKenna was standing perfectly still. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't drawn his gun. He was just there, his winter sky eyes fixed on the miner's hand on Josie's arm. There was no anger in his expression, only a profound and unsettling stillness, a promise of absolute consequence. The miner, suddenly sober, let her go as if she were a hot coal. He mumbled an apology and retreated back into the crowd. Elias met Josie's gaze for a fraction of a second, then turned and walked out of the saloon. He never said a word. The white silk of the wedding dress had been cool against her skin. Josie remembered the feel of it, the whisper it made as she walked. She had been 19, her heart a fluttering bird in her chest, full of foolish, dazzling hope. Samuel Granger was handsome, with a quick smile and eyes that promised her a world of comfort and adoration. He was a merchant's son, and she, a farmer's daughter, had felt like a princess in a storybook. The first year had been a blur of stolen kisses and shared dreams. They would build a house, have children, He was going to expand his father's business, but there was a restlessness in Samuel, a hunger for more, for faster. He started playing cards, just small games at first. He'd come home late, smelling of cigars and whiskey, either elated by a win or sullen from a loss. The games got bigger. The losses mounted. She saw the hope in his eyes curdle into desperation. She pleaded with him to stop. He promised he would. After one more game, one more chance to win it all back. He sold her mother's locket. He sold the plot of land they were meant to build on. One night, he didn't come home at all. The next morning, Rafe Conrad appeared at her door. He was polite, almost charming, as he explained that Samuel had incurred a significant debt, a debt of $500. "He has nothing left to pay you with," she had said, her voice trembling. Rafe's smile was a thin, cruel line. "Oh, he had one last thing of value. Mrs. Granger, he signed it over to me last night." He produced a piece of paper, a bill of sale. It was for her services, her time, her body, until the debt was paid in full. Her husband had not just gambled away their future, he had sold her into bondage. Samuel disappeared 2 days later, leaving town in the dead of night. Josie never saw him again. She was left with nothing but a torn dress, a bruised body from her first refusal, and a shame so deep it felt like it had replaced her bones. She tried to run once. She'd saved a few dollars and slipped out of town. Heading east, Rafe's men caught her before she'd gone 20 miles. They dragged her back. The punishment was methodical and cruel, designed not just to hurt her body but to shatter her will. After that, she learned, you don't escape, you endure, you survive. Hope was the cruelest trick of all, a flickering candle in a hurricane. It was better to live in the dark. Elias dreamed of his sister. It was never a peaceful memory, but a frantic, disjointed nightmare. He was 17 again, and Ellie was 15, her laughter like wind chimes in the summer heat. She had hair the color of corn silk and a smile that could charm a rattlesnake. She was chasing a butterfly in a field of wildflowers, her simple cotton dress swirling around her knees. Then the dream would shift, the colors darkening, the air growing cold. The wildflowers would wither and turn to dust. Ellie was running, but not in play. She was running from shadows, from faceless, laughing men. He could hear her calling his name, but his feet were stuck in thick mud, the same mud that now lined the street of Ash Valley. He fought to move, to scream, but no sound came out. The dream always ended the same way, with him finding her dress, torn and discarded by the creek bed. He never saw her face again, only the empty space she left behind. He would wake up with his heart hammering against his ribs, the guilt a physical weight on his chest. He had been working on a neighboring ranch that day, too far away to hear her. By the time he found out, it was too late. The men responsible were wealthy. Their fathers owned half the county. The sheriff had called it a tragic accident. Elias had called it murder. His quest for justice had gotten him beaten and run out of town. He had failed her. He saw Ellie's ghost in every vulnerable woman he met, and he saw Josie as the woman he had been too late to save. His decency wasn't a virtue. It was a penance, a constant, silent apology to a ghost he could never appease. Their conversations began tentatively, like two wary animals circling a waterhole. She found him one afternoon reinforcing a loose rail on the corral at the livery. "Fixing things seems to be a habit of yours," she said, her arms crossed. He didn't look up from his work, just kept hammering the nail. "A loose rail is a danger to the horses." "And a loose hinge?" she asked, her voice edged with sarcasm. "Is that a danger to the woman who lives behind the door?" He finally stopped and looked at her. "A door that doesn't lock is an invitation to trouble." "And the food in my bag? What kind of trouble was that preventing?" "Hunger," he said simply, turning back to his work. The simplicity of his answers frustrated her. She wanted to provoke him, to get a rise out of him. to make him show the same ugliness she saw in every other man, but he wouldn't bite. "They're calling you the righteous drifter down at the saloon," she mocked, though there was no real venom in it. "Saint Elias of Ash Valley, protector of fallen women." "I'm just a man passing through," he said, his voice low. "You've been passing through for 3 weeks, she pointed out. "For a drifter, you don't do much drifting." That made him pause. He straightened up, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. "The passes are still muddy. I'm waiting for the ground to harden." It was an excuse, and they both knew it. She scoffed, but a strange warmth bloomed in her chest. His quiet presence had become a fixture in her life. His decency, which she had initially scorned, now felt like a steady flame in the cold draft of her existence. It stung her more than Rafe's cruelty ever had. Cruelty was expected. She knew how to brace for it. But this quiet, unrelenting kindness made her feel the full, crushing weight of her own degradation. It reminded her of the person she used to be, the hopeful girl in the white silk dress, and the grief for that lost girl was a sharper pain than any physical blow. The breaking point came on a cold, rain-lashed night. Rafe had been losing at cards, and his mood was fouler than the weather. He'd found a small flaw in Josie's work, a glass that wasn't polished to his satisfaction. It was an excuse. In the back room, away from prying eyes, he let his rage loose. He hit her, not with the flat of his hand, but with his fist. The blow caught her on the side of her ribs, stealing her breath and sending a blinding flash of pain through her body. She fell against a stack of crates, the impact driving the air from her lungs. He kicked her once for good measure before leaving her crumpled on the floor. She lay there for a long time, listening to the tinny piano music and the raucous laughter from the saloon. Eventually, she managed to pull herself to her feet, every breath a fresh agony. She stumbled out the back door into the alley, gasping in the cold, wet air. The rain plastered her hair to her face. She leaned against the rough wooden wall of the saloon, tears of pain and humiliation finally tracking paths through the grime on her cheeks. She didn't know how long she stood there before she sensed him. Elias emerged from the shadows of the alley like he had been summoned by her pain. He must have seen her go into the back room with Rafe. He must have been waiting. He said nothing. He just looked at her, his face grim in the dim light spilling from a nearby window. He saw the way she was holding herself, the way each breath was a shallow, painful gasp. Without a word, he stepped forward and swept her up into his arms. The movement was so swift and sure, she didn't have time to protest. "No," she whispered, the word a faint puff of air. "Put me down." She began to struggle weakly in his arms. "Don't look at me." He ignored her pleas, holding her firmly but gently. He carried her through the muddy back streets of Ash Valley, his long strides eating up the distance to his small cabin. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, setting her down carefully on the single chair by the cold hearth. He lit a lamp, the warm glow pushing back the shadows. He knelt before her, his expression a mixture of anger and a deep, aching sorrow. "Where does it hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. "Leave me alone," she choked out, wrapping her arms around herself. The movement sent a fresh wave of agony through her side. She couldn't hide the grimace of pain. "I'm not leaving you," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Let me see." "No!" The word was sharp, desperate. The thought of him seeing the bruises, seeing the proof of her shame, was more than she could bear. Elias's jaw tightened. He stood and retrieved a basin of water and a roll of clean bandages from a small chest. He brought them back and set them on the floor beside her. "I won't look," he said quietly, "but I have to wrap your ribs. They might be broken." She watched him, her breathing ragged. His promise seemed impossible, but there was a sincerity in his voice that cut through her fear. Trembling, she allowed him to turn her chair so her back was mostly to him. With fumbling fingers, she unlaced the front of her dress, her hands shaking too much to manage the hooks. He reached around, his large, calloused hands brushing hers as he took over. His touch was impersonal, efficient. He unhooked the dress and gently pushed it off her shoulders, letting it fall to her waist. She was left in her chemise and corset, working by the lamplight. He soaked a cloth in the water and gently cleaned the scraped skin on her back where she had hit the crates. He was true to his word. His gaze was fixed on his work, his hands moving with a practiced gentleness. When he was done cleaning the abrasions, he took the roll of bandages. He started to wrap it around her torso, his arms circling her. The bandage went over her chemise, over the stiff boning of her corset. His knuckles brushed against her skin. A brief, accidental contact that sent a jolt through her entire body. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. She could smell the clean scent of soap and the faint, masculine scent of sawdust and leather. He was bandaging her wounds without touching her skin, a feat of restraint so profound it felt more intimate than any caress. When he was finished, he tied off the bandage and stood up. "It's done." The tears she had been holding back finally fell. They were not for the pain in her ribs, but for the torment in her soul. She turned to face him, her eyes swimming. "Why are you doing this?" He looked at the floor, at the wall, anywhere but at her. No one should have to suffer that. His mercy was a blade, twisting in her heart. "I do not want your mercy," she said, her voice breaking. The words tumbled out, a torrent of pain and longing she could no longer contain. "I do not want to be your charity or your good deed. I want to matter to someone. I just want to matter." Her confession, raw and desperate, hung in the small, lamp-lit cabin. It finally forced him to look at her. His face was a mask of anguish, his own demons warring in his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was thick with a pain that matched her own. "You do," he whispered, the words torn from him. "You do matter." He took a half-step toward her, his hand lifting as if to touch her face, before he caught himself and let it drop to his side. "But I ain't good enough to let myself show it." The space between them crackled with unspoken emotions, with shared brokenness and a fragile, terrifying connection. Outside, the world had gone silent. A single, white flake drifted past the window. Then another and another. The rain had turned to snow. It was the first snow of the season, a soft, quiet blanket that would soon close the passes and cover the mud. It would bury the town of Ash Valley in a deep and silent white, trapping them both together in the long winter to come. The snow fell without sound, a thick, determined curtain that erased the world. It buried the mud of Ash Valley, softened the hard edges of the mountains, and silenced the ceaseless roar of the stamp mill. For Elias and Josie, it turned the small, one-room cabin into the entire universe. It was a prison of quiet intimacy, a forced sanctuary where two broken people had to learn the rhythm of each other's breathing. Elias gave her the bed. He took a thin blanket and slept on the floor by the hearth, a silent, unmovable guardian. His presence was a constant, solid thing in the night. In the mornings, he would be gone before she woke, slipping out into the pre-dawn gray to check his snares or hunt. He always returned with something, a pair of rabbits, a grouse, his quiet offerings against the encroaching winter. He never spoke of the night he'd carried her here, or of the night she had come to his door. Those moments hung in the air between them, unspoken and yet shaping every glance, every gesture. Josie's ribs healed slowly, the deep, ugly ache a constant reminder of Rafe's cruelty. At first, she did little more than watch the snow fall, a listless ghost haunting the small cabin. But as her strength returned, a restless energy took hold. She couldn't bear the stillness. She found Elias's mending kit and began repairing the tears in his worn flannel shirts, her stitches small and neat. She learned the particular creak of the floorboard that announced his return and would have a pot of thin rabbit stew simmering over the fire. They ate in near silence, the crackle of the flames and the howling of the wind their only dinner companions. It was a fragile imitation of domesticity, a life she had once dreamed of. And the bitter irony of it was a constant ache in her throat. The town, however, did not stay silent. When the snow let up for a day, Elias had to go in for supplies: flour, salt, coffee. The moment he stepped into the general store, he felt it. The whispers that died when he drew near, the sideways glances from the men, the cold, hard stares from the women. It was Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, who made it plain, a stout woman whose piety was a weapon. She saw him by the flour barrels and gave him a look of such profound condemnation it could have soured milk. She gathered her skirts and moved to the other side of the store as if he carried a contagion. The whispers followed him into the street. "That's him, the drifter." "Got that saloon girl holed up in his cabin. Playing wife to the cowboy. She is—" The words were like stones, small and sharp. They weren't just judging her. They were judging him for seeing any worth in her at all. To them, she was sullied goods, and he was a fool for treating her like anything else. He ignored it. He packed his supplies, paid his money, and walked back to the cabin, his shoulders set against the wind and the town's scorn. But the poison had been sown. He saw a new tension in Josie when he returned. She knew what they were saying without him having to repeat it. She had lived with that judgment for years. Now, she was watching it stain him, too. A few days later, the fight happened. Elias was at the livery, negotiating the price of hay for the owner's horses, when 3 of Rafe Conrad's men cornered him. One of them, a burly miner named Harker with a perpetually sneering face, stepped in his path. "Well, well, if it ain't St. Elias," Harker sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boots. "Heard you're running a little mission house for fallen doves out on the edge of town." Elias didn't rise to the bait. He met the man's gaze, his own face impassive. "I've got no business with you, Harker." "Oh, I think you do," Harker said. Stepping closer, his friends fanned out, cutting off any retreat. "See, a man like you comes into town, thinks he's better than everyone else, thinks he can just take what belongs to another man." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. Harker laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She belongs to whoever's got the price, and from what I hear, she ain't worth much these days. Just a used-up saloon girl playing house, thinking a man's coat can cover up what she is." That was the line. It wasn't the insult to him that did it. It was the casual, brutal dismissal of her, the attempt to strip her of the last vestiges of her dignity. A flicker of something cold and deadly moved in Elias's eyes. Harker saw the shift and took it as a challenge. He threw a clumsy, powerful punch that caught Elias high on the cheekbone. Elias's head snapped back, but he didn't fall. He stood there, tasting blood, his eyes never leaving Harker's. "Not so tough now. Are you preacher man?" Harker taunted and hit him again. A solid blow to the jaw. Elias took the punch. He stood his ground, his body absorbing the impact. He refused to hit back, his code demanding he not be the one to start the violence. But Harker had already started it. And he had insulted Josie. The rules had changed. After the second blow, Elias moved. It wasn't a flurry of motion, but a single, clean, economical act of violence. He stepped forward, putting his entire weight behind a punch that landed squarely on Harker's jaw. The sound was a sickening crack, like a dead branch snapping. Harker's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed in a heap in the dirty straw. The other 2 men stared, stunned, then took a step back. Elias looked at them, his chest heaving, his face a mask of cold fury. They wanted no part of it. He turned without another word and walked away. When he got back to the cabin, Josie was waiting. She saw the split lip and the dark, swelling bruise on his cheek the moment he stepped through the door. Her face went pale. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Nothing," he said, moving past her to the water basin. "Do not lie to me," she said, her voice suddenly fierce. She took the wet cloth from his hand and gently dabbed at the cut on his lip. Her touch was feather-light, a stark contrast to the storm in her eyes. "It was about me, wasn't it? What did they say?" He flinched, not from the sting of the water, but from the question. He didn't want to bring the town's ugliness into this small, quiet space. Her expression hardened with a bitter certainty. "You don't have to tell me. I know the words." She finished cleaning the cut, her movements efficient and angry. She was touched. He could see it in the slight tremor of her hands, but her bitterness was a shield she could not put down. "It was a fool thing to do," she said, her voice flat. "You'll never win. You can't fight a whole town. Men like Rafe. They don't just own the saloon. They own the sheriff. They own the law. They own everything." He knew she was right, but he couldn't let it be. The next morning, his face a painful roadmap of the previous day's fight. He walked to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was leaning back in his chair, polishing his gold watch with a silk cloth. He looked up at Elias and sighed, a sound of profound boredom. "Let me guess," Brody said. "You're here to report that Caleb Harker ran into your fist. I've already heard. He'll be drinking his soup through a straw for a month." "I'm here about Rafe Conrad," Elias said, his voice even. "He assaulted Josie Granger, beat her bad enough to break a rib." Brody set his watch down with a deliberate care. "Did he now? And do you have a witness to this assault?" "I am the witness to the result of it," Elias said. "Her injuries speak for themselves." The sheriff chuckled, a low, rumbling sound from his belly. "Son, let me explain how things work in Ash Valley. Rafe Conrad is a businessman, a very successful businessman. He has investments in the mine, the freight company, this very office, if you take my meaning. He keeps things running. Josie Granger, on the other hand, is a saloon dancer with a debt. She is, in the eyes of the law, his employee, a piece of property, you might say. What a man does with his property is his own business, so long as he doesn't disturb the peace." Elias felt a cold rage settle in his gut. "What he did is a crime." "What you're doing," Brody said, leaning forward, his voice losing its lazy tone, "is disturbing the peace. You're a drifter. You have no stake here. You come into my town. You start a fight, and now you're trying to stir up trouble for one of my most prominent citizens. I could have you locked up for vagrancy right now." He picked up his watch and looked at it. "My advice to you is to take your saloon girl and ride out as soon as the pass is clear. There's nothing for you here but a pine box." The law was as broken as the town. Josie was right. Elias walked out of the sheriff's office, the feeling of utter helplessness a bitter taste in his mouth. He returned to the cabin not with justice, but with the cold, hard proof that none was to be had. The tension in the cabin grew thick enough to choke on. The unspoken thing between them was a living entity now, pacing the floorboards, sitting at the table with them, watching them from the shadows. The failed attempt with the sheriff had stripped away Elias's last defense. He could no longer pretend that doing things the right way would work. All that was left was the raw, undeniable connection between him and the woman across the hearth. One evening, after a day of heavy silence, Josie made her move. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She had been mending one of his shirts, but now she set it aside. She was wearing another one of his, a soft, worn flannel that dwarfed her small frame. It was more intimate than if she had been wearing nothing at all. She stood up and walked to the hearth, standing before the flames with her back to him. She didn't speak. She just stood there, the firelight shining through the thin fabric, outlining the soft curves of her body. It was a silent, desperate offering, an invitation, a question. Elias's breath hitched. He watched her, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. Every instinct in him screamed to go to her, to close the distance between them, and finally, touch her. He could feel the imagined warmth of her skin, the silk of her hair. He wanted to pull her back against his chest and whisper that he would protect her, that he would burn the whole town down for her, but the ghosts of his past were there, too. The ghost of Ellie, and the specter of his own failure. He saw the bruises on Josie's soul, and he knew he was too rough, too broken a thing to touch them. To take what she was offering would be to admit defeat, to become just another man who used her for his own needs. With a strangled cry, he shoved himself up from the chair, the legs scraping violently against the floor. He turned and strode to the door, flinging it open and walking out into the biting cold of the night without grabbing his coat. The snow was falling again, thick and heavy. The frigid air was a shock to his lungs, a welcome pain. He stood in the swirling white, his fists clenched at his sides, trying to master the storm inside him. The cabin door opened behind him. She was standing there, framed in the warm yellow light, the big shirt her only shield against the elements. Snowflakes melted in her dark hair. Her face was a mask of raw, furious emotion. "Why?" she screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet night. "Why won't you touch me?" He turned to face her, his own control shattered. The anguish was plain on his face, a raw wound for her to see. "Because if I do," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken, "I won't be able to stop." The confession broke the last thread of restraint. In 2 long strides, he was before her. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks as if she were made of spun glass. He looked into her stormy gray eyes, and for a moment, the entire world fell away. There was only the falling snow and the two of them, suspended in a moment of terrible, beautiful honesty. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss, it was a collision, a desperate, breathless fusion of all the pain, loneliness, and fierce, unspoken longing that had festered between them. It was the taste of his blood and her tears, of wood smoke in winter. It was a promise and a prayer, a question and an answer. For a few frantic heartbeats, they clung to each other, 2 drowning souls holding on to the only solid thing in a raging sea. Then, with a shuddering gasp that felt like it was torn from the very root of his soul, he pulled away. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his breathing ragged. The torment on his face was agonizing to behold. "You deserve more," he whispered, his voice thick with self-loathing. "You deserve more than being saved by a man who's still broken." He stepped back, leaving her standing alone in the doorway, the cold rushing in to fill the space where he had been. He turned and walked away from the light of the cabin, disappearing into the swirling darkness of the snowstorm. Elias returned to the cabin just before dawn, a ghost covered in a fresh shroud of snow. He had walked for hours, letting the biting cold scour the heat and confusion from his blood. He found Josie asleep in the chair by the hearth, a blanket wrapped around her, his half-mended shirt still clutched in her hand. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. He gently lifted her, his movements sure and careful, and placed her in the bed, pulling the covers over her. He did not allow himself to linger. He rekindled the fire and then settled back onto his own cold patch of floor, his back to her, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing until the sun came up. They did not speak of the kiss. It was a new ghost, more potent than the others, that now inhabited the small space with them. A fragile truce held for a few days, a period of heavy silence and averted gazes. The snowstorm passed, leaving the world pristine and dangerously quiet. They were suspended in a moment of limbo, the question of what came next, an unspoken weight in the air. Rafe Conrad did not like unanswered questions. He did not like his authority challenged, and he certainly did not like his property being withheld. His retaliation was not long in coming. It began with fire. One night, a savage orange glow flickered against the cabin window. Elias was awake instantly, his senses screaming a warning. He was on his feet and out the door in a second, his Colt in his hand. The small, lean-to barn he had built to shelter the livery owner's spare horse, a creature he'd been tending in exchange for supplies, was engulfed in flames. The fire roared against the black, snowy landscape, a hungry, malevolent beast consuming the dry timber. The horse, terrified, was screaming, a sound of pure animal panic. It was too late. The roof was already collapsing inward in a shower of sparks. There was nothing he could do but watch it burn, a symbol of any potential future turning to ash before his eyes. The next morning, the town learned of the fire when Josie, her face pale and set, walked into the general store for thread. She was met with a wall of hostile silence. As she stood at the counter, Rafe Conrad entered, flanked by two of his men. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a wolf circling its prey. He stopped in front of her, his voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Enjoying your vacation, Josie? You seem to have forgotten your obligations." Josie's chin lifted. "I have no obligations to you." Rafe laughed. "Your debt says otherwise, a debt you seem to have no intention of repaying." He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. "This contract is ironclad. And now," he added, his voice dropping to a venomous stage whisper, "I find that $100 is missing from the saloon's cash box. It disappeared the same night you did." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Josie's face drained of all color. "I took nothing." "That is for the sheriff to decide," Rafe said smoothly. He nodded to his men. One of them produced a set of iron manacles. The metallic click as he unlocked them echoed in the silent store. "Sheriff Brody has issued a warrant for theft." He was making a public spectacle of it, shaming her, branding her not just a harlot but a thief. He was showing the entire town, and Elias, that she was his to command, his to disgrace. One of the men grabbed her arm. She tried to pull away, a flicker of her old defiance flaring in her eyes, but the other man grabbed her other arm. They were strong, brutal. They forced her hands behind her back and locked the cold, heavy iron around her wrists. A collective gasp went through the women in the store. It wasn't a sound of sympathy, but of horrified, righteous satisfaction. They dragged her out of the store and down the main street, a prisoner on display. She held her head high, her eyes fixed on some distant point, refusing to let them see her cry. They were taking her back to the saloon, back to the cage she had almost escaped. When Elias heard the news from the livery owner, a cold, killing rage unlike anything he had ever known settled over him. It was a silent, focused fury that burned away all his hesitation, all his self-doubt. They had put her in chains. It was a violation so profound, so absolute, that it broke the last lock on his own tightly controlled soul. He did not go to the sheriff. He knew that path was a dead end. Instead, he went back to the cabin. He went to the small, battered trunk that held Josie's few belongings, the ones he had quietly retrieved from her room at the boarding house weeks ago. He had never opened it, respecting her privacy. Now, he pried the flimsy lock. Inside were the remnants of another life, a pressed flower, a book of poetry, a child's drawing, and at the bottom, a small, lacquered box. It contained a few pieces of jewelry, worthless trinkets, and a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. They were from her husband, Samuel. Tucked inside the bundle was a folded document. It was a bill of sale, the original agreement Samuel had made with Rafe Conrad, pledging Josie's services against his debt. Elias studied it, his eyes tracing the looping signature of Samuel Granger. He had seen the contract Rafe had flaunted at the store. He had gotten a good look at it. There was a difference. In his mind's eye, he compared the two signatures. The one on Rafe's document was cleaner, more confident. The one on this original document was shaky, the frantic scrawl of a desperate, defeated man. Rafe hadn't just taken ownership of Josie, he had forged a new contract, one without the clauses and conditions of the original, a document that gave him absolute power. He had a weapon now. He walked to the Lucky Ribbon Saloon, the original contract tucked inside his coat. He didn't pause at the swinging doors. He kicked them open with such force that they slammed against the inside walls. The saloon, busy with the afternoon crowd, fell silent, every head turned. Elias's eyes, cold as chips of ice, scanned the room and found Rafe sitting at his usual table in the back, a proprietary smile on his face. Josie was standing near the bar, her hands still in chains, her face a pale, emotionless mask. Two of Rafe's thugs stood near her, a clear warning. Elias walked slowly toward the center of the room. He did not go for his gun. His hands were empty, held loosely at his sides. "Take the chains off her," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. Rafe chuckled and took a sip of his whiskey. "The drifter comes to play hero again. She's a thief, McKenna. She's where she belongs." "Take them off," Elias repeated, his voice dropping lower, colder. "Now." Rafe gestured, and his two men by the bar started to move toward Elias. But Elias's gaze never left Rafe. "This is between you and me. Conrad, call them off, or the next man who takes a step toward me will be the first to die." There was no boast in his words, only a flat statement of fact. The men hesitated, looking to Rafe. Rafe studied Elias for a long moment, a flicker of uncertainty in his cold eyes. He had seen Elias fight. He gave a slight nod, and the men stopped. "You're a fool," Rafe said. "There's nothing you can do." "You're right," Elias agreed, the words shocking the room. "A gun won't solve this. The law in this town is a joke, but even a joke has a punchline." He reached into his coat and pulled out the folded document. He let it drop onto a poker table in the center of the room. "You're a careful man, Rafe, but your forgery is clumsy." Rafe's smile vanished. His face went rigid. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You do," Elias said. "You took the contract Samuel Granger signed and you wrote a new one that made you her master instead of just her debt holder. But you got the signature wrong. It's a good copy, but it's not the same." He looked around the room, his eyes meeting those of the miners and merchants. "A man's signature is his bond. Forgery is a hanging offense in this territory. And I have the original, signed by Samuel Granger himself." A murmur went through the crowd. This was something they understood. Contracts, signatures, the law of property. That was the bedrock of their world. "That's a lie," Rafe snarled, rising from his chair. "Is it?" Elias challenged. "Then let's call Sheriff Brody. Let's compare the two documents. Let's find a man who knew Samuel Granger's hand and ask him to testify." Rafe was trapped. His public accusation of theft had now been countered by a public accusation of a far more serious crime. He had overplayed his hand. He looked from Elias's unyielding face to the curious, suspicious eyes of the men in his saloon. His authority was crumbling. Sheriff Brody arrived a few minutes later, looking deeply unhappy. He listened to Elias's claim, looked at the document on the table, and then looked at Rafe's pale, furious face. He knew a cornered rat when he saw one. Forgery was a federal crime. Ignoring it publicly could cost him his comfortable position. "Rafe," the sheriff said with a weary sigh, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. We need to sort this out." "You can't be serious," Rafe hissed. "The charge has been made," Brody said, his voice firm for the first time since Elias had met him. He had to make a show of it. "The theft charge against Miss Granger is dropped. Now, let's go." Reluctantly, Brody took Rafe by the arm. As they passed Josie, Elias stepped forward. "The keys. Sheriff." Brody grumbled but tossed the keys to the manacles to Elias. As Rafe was led out, his eyes, full of murderous hatred, locked on Elias. "This isn't over, McKenna." Elias ignored him. He knelt before Josie and carefully unlocked the chains. They fell to the floor with a heavy clank. He stood and looked at her, at the raw, red marks on her wrists. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the bruised skin. She flinched but didn't pull away. For the first time, She let him see the vulnerability in her eyes. He had not just saved her. He had given her back her name. She moved back into the cabin with him. She was free, but the freedom was a fragile, unfamiliar thing. She was quiet, withdrawn, emotionally guarded. The chains were gone, but the ghost of their weight remained. She spent her days staring out the window or reading the one book she owned, as if relearning how to be a person who was not owned by anyone. One afternoon, she took out a small bundle of old fabric she had bought with the last of her dancing money. It was simple calico, a faded blue with a small, repeating pattern of white flowers. With the thread she had tried to buy on that fateful day, she began to sew. She did not use a pattern. She worked from memory, her hands moving with a slow, deliberate grace. For days, she sat by the fire, the needle rising and falling, a rhythmic, meditative act. She was not mending his clothes. She was creating something for herself. She was stitching together a new identity from the scraps of her old one. The dress she made was simple, with a high collar and long sleeves. It was modest, beautiful, and utterly her own. It was not the white silk of a hopeful bride, nor the crimson satin of a saloon dancer. It was the dress of a woman who had survived. That evening, as a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distant mountains, she emerged from the small, curtained-off corner of the cabin where she slept. She was wearing the new dress. She looked beautiful, but more than that, she looked whole. Elias, who was cleaning his rifle by the fire, looked up. His hands stilled. He stared at her, and his heart felt like it would break from the sheer, painful beauty of her resilience. The thunderstorm broke over the mountains, the wind rattling the small cabin, the rain lashing against the windows. The world outside was a tempest of sound and fury, but inside, a profound quiet had fallen. They stood on opposite sides of the room, the air thick with everything they had been through, with everything they had not said. Slowly, Elias put down his rifle. He stood and walked toward her. He stopped a foot away, his eyes searching hers. He raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "You're beautiful," he whispered. She didn't mock him. She didn't turn away. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. He gently wiped it away with his thumb. Then, he leaned in and kissed her. It was not like the first kiss in the snow, desperate and frantic. This was a kiss of infinite tenderness, of reverence. He led her to the bed, his movements unhurried, gentle. The room was dark, lit only by the occasional, brilliant flash of lightning from the storm outside. He reached for the lamp. "No," she whispered, her hand stopping his. "Leave it." He looked at her, a question in his eyes. "I still can't watch you cry," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. It was a confession of his own brokenness, an admission that her pain was a mirror to his own. She understood. She understood everything in that moment. She gave him a small, sad, beautiful smile. He began to unbutton the simple calico dress, his hands reverent. He made love to her in the darkness, to the rhythm of the rain on the roof and the thunder in the mountains. It was a slow, gentle joining, a quiet healing, an act of worship for the simple, miraculous fact of their survival. Later, as they lay tangled together under the blankets, the storm receding into a gentle patter, she turned to him in the darkness. "Elias," she said, her voice soft in the quiet room. He made a sound to show he was listening. "You closed your eyes the first time I stood bare before you," she whispered. "That's the only reason I wanted you to open them tonight." The peace was a fragile, sunlit thing, as delicate as a patch of snow melting in the spring. For 2 weeks after Rafe's arrest, a quiet normalcy settled over the cabin. Elias and Josie moved around each other with a new, tender awareness. The space that had once crackled with tension now hummed with a soft, unspoken intimacy. They talked more, their conversations filling the silences that had once been so heavy. She told him about her childhood on a farm, of the smell of rain on dry earth and the feel of her father's calloused hand in hers. He spoke of the plains, of the vast, unending sky, and the quiet companionship of a good horse. He never spoke of Ellie, not by name, but Josie could feel the ghost of that sorrow in the pauses between his words, and she did not press him. He rebuilt the small barn. His hammer blows a steady, reassuring rhythm in the crisp winter air. She would bring him coffee, their hands brushing as she passed him the cup. A small, accidental contact that sent a jolt of warmth through them both. They were building something more than a barn. They were piecing together the foundations of a life, a small, defiant fortress against the world. But they both knew the world was still out there, just beyond the tree line. The warning came from Mr. Abernathy, the livery owner, a decent man who had seen too much of Rafe Conrad's brand of justice. He rode out to the cabin one afternoon, his face grim. "He's out, Elias," Abernathy said, not dismounting. "Brody let him go 2 days ago. Said there wasn't enough evidence for a trial. One of the deputies who was supposed to guard him has gone missing, along with a good deal of ammunition from the sheriff's lockup." Elias's face went hard. He looked from Abernathy to the cabin, where Josie was standing in the doorway, her face pale. "Thank you for the warning," he said quietly. "It's more than a warning," Abernathy said, his gaze grave. "Rafe's been gathering men, not just his usual thugs. He's hired on some hard cases from the mining camps up north. He's telling everyone you're a claim jumper and she's a thief, that you stole his property. He's whipping them into a frenzy. You need to leave, now. Take my horse. Just go." Elias shook his head. "We're done running." Abernathy looked at him with a mixture of pity and respect. "Then God help you both." He turned his horse and rode away, a lone figure disappearing into the stark, white landscape. They knew they didn't have much time. That evening, as a bruised purple twilight bled across the snow, they prepared. Elias cleaned and oiled his Colt and the Winchester rifle he had bought with his wages. He had only 2 boxes of cartridges, not nearly enough. He boarded up the single window of the cabin, leaving only a small slit to see through. "You'll stay in here," he told Josie, his voice tight. "No matter what you hear, you stay inside." She looked at the rifle in his hands, then at her own, which were trembling slightly. "And what am I supposed to do?" He hesitated, then took a small, single-shot Derringer from his saddlebag. It was small enough to fit in her palm. "If they get in," he said, his voice low and raw, "use this. Don't let them take you." The words were a bitter poison on his tongue. He was asking her to choose death over capture. She took the small pistol, its weight a cold, final thing in her hand. She did not cry. Her face was set, a mask of fierce, terrified resolve. The girl who had endured was gone. The woman who would fight was here. The attack came after dark. There was no warning, no shouted demand for surrender. There was only the sudden, whooshing roar of fire. A flaming arrow thudded into the roof of the cabin, followed by another. Then, a torch arced through the air, landing in the hay piled against the new barn. In seconds, the night was torn apart by a maelstrom of orange and yellow flames. "They're trying to burn us out," Elias said, peering through the slit in the boarded window. He could see at least 6 or 7 dark figures moving in the trees at the edge of the clearing, their forms stark against the backdrop of the burning barn. "Stay down!" He kicked open the cabin door and laid down 2 quick, suppressive shots from the Winchester toward the tree line, forcing the attackers to take cover. Then he was out, a fleeting shadow against the firelight, rolling behind the meager cover of a woodpile. The air exploded with the crack of rifles. Bullets tore through the night, splintering the logs of the cabin and kicking up plumes of snow. Elias was methodical, his movements economical. He did not waste shots. He aimed, fired, and moved. He saw a man step out from behind a pine, and the Winchester bucked against his shoulder. The man cried out and fell. Inside the cabin, Josie was on the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought they would break. The derringer was clutched in her hand, the metal icy against her sweaty palm. The cabin was filling with smoke from the smoldering roof. Each gunshot from outside was a physical blow, a terrifying punctuation mark in a symphony of destruction. She could hear men shouting, cursing. She could hear Elias's rifle, a deeper, more deliberate report than the others. She prayed with every shot, a frantic, wordless plea to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. Elias moved from the woodpile to the cover of a large boulder, the snow soaking through his trousers. He knew he was badly outnumbered. He was picking them off, but it was only a matter of time. A bullet ricocheted off the rock near his head, sending stone splinters stinging into his cheek. He fired again, and another shadow in the trees dropped. That was two. He risked a glance back at the cabin. The fire on the roof was spreading. Josie had to get out. He saw a flicker of movement to his left and turned, bringing the rifle up. But he was a fraction of a second too late. A searing, white-hot pain tore through his shoulder. The force of the impact spun him around and knocked him to the ground. The Winchester flew from his grasp, landing in the snow a few feet away. He lay there, stunned, the world a dizzying blur of fire and snow. He tried to push himself up, but his left arm was useless, a dead weight of agony. He could feel warm blood soaking his shirt and coat. He saw another attacker break from the tree line, running toward him, a pistol raised. Elias fumbled for his Colt with his right hand. He fired from the ground, the shot going wide. The man fired back, and Elias felt a second, brutal impact in his side, a deep, gut-wrenching blow that stole his breath. He fired again, and this time his aim was true. The man stumbled, clutched his chest, and fell face first into the snow. 3, but it was over. The world was going gray at the edges. He could hear boots crunching in the snow. Coming closer. He tried to raise the Colt for one last shot, but his strength was gone. He collapsed, his face pressed into the freezing snow. The sound of Rafe's triumphant laughter, the last thing he heard before the darkness took him. From the smoky cabin, Josie had seen it all. She saw Elias go down. She saw him fire his last shot. She saw him collapse. A primal scream of pure, animal terror and rage tore from her throat. For a second, she was paralyzed, her mind a white-hot blank of horror. Then, something inside her broke. The fear was still there, a cold, sickening serpent in her belly, but it was now joined by a ferocious, protective fury. She kicked open the cabin door, the derringer forgotten on the floor. The heat from the burning barn and the roof was intense. She ran to Elias, ignoring the bullets that whizzed past her. She knelt beside him, rolling him over. His face was ghostly pale in the firelight, his eyes closed. There was so much blood. "Elias," she sobbed, shaking him. He didn't respond. She could hear Rafe and his men approaching, their victory shouts echoing in the night. She didn't have time to think. She hooked her arms under his, and, with a strength born of pure desperation, she began to drag him. He was a dead weight, an impossible burden, but she pulled, her boots slipping in the bloody snow, her muscles screaming in protest. She dragged him, foot by agonizing foot, toward the one place that offered any cover, the burning barn. The fire was mostly on the far side, but the heat was a solid wall. Smoke billowed out of the open doors. She dragged him inside, into the suffocating darkness, and collapsed beside him, her lungs heaving. She found a relatively clear spot behind a stack of hay bales that had not yet caught fire. She could hear the men outside, laughing. "He's done for," one of them said. "Let's get the girl and finish this." Josie's terror returned, cold and sharp. She looked down at Elias's still form, and then her eyes fell on the Winchester, lying just inside the barn door where it must have been kicked. She crawled to it, her movements frantic. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold it. She had never fired a rifle in her life. She pulled the heavy weapon back behind the hay bales, checked the lever action as she had seen Elias do, and aimed it toward the open barn door. A silhouette appeared, black against the fire outside. A man stepped in, a pistol in his hand, his eyes trying to adjust to the smoky dark. "Josie," he called out in a sing-song voice. "Come on out. Rafe just wants to talk." Josie squeezed her eyes shut, aimed at the center of the dark mass, and pulled the trigger. The rifle's kick was a brutal, shocking force, slamming the stock into her shoulder and knocking her backward. The roar of the shot in the enclosed space was deafening. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and surprise, and fell, clutching his leg. He scrambled backward out of the barn, screaming for help. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably now. Tears streamed down her face. She had shot a man, but Elias was still breathing, his breath shallow and ragged beside her. She reloaded the rifle, the metallic click of the lever a small, defiant sound in the chaos. She would not let them have him. Just as another man started to approach the barn, a new sound cut through the night, a shout, and then another volley of gunshots. But this time they were not aimed at the barn. Josie peered through a gap in the wooden slats. In the firelight, she saw two figures running toward the clearing from the direction of the neighboring ranch. It was Mr. Stinson, a quiet farmer whose land bordered theirs, and his grown son, Mr. Stinson was firing an old hunting rifle, his son a shotgun. The Stinsons were a family who kept to themselves. They had watched Elias and Josie with a distant, wary curiosity. They had seen the drifter and the saloon girl, and they had seen the town's scorn, but they had also seen the smoke. They had seen the fire of a burning home, and that was a line that, for a decent man, could not be crossed. Their unexpected arrival threw Rafe's men into confusion. They had come for an easy victory, not a pitched battle. One of them, seeing the tide turning, broke and ran for the darkness of the trees. Then another. Rafe screamed at them, cursing them as cowards, but the fight had gone out of them. Only Rafe was left, his face a mask of incandescent fury in the firelight. He saw Josie, a ghostly figure in the smoky doorway of the barn. His obsession, his property, the cause of all his trouble. He ignored the Stinsons and charged toward her, his pistol raised. "You are mine!" he roared, his face contorted with madness. Josie stood up, the heavy Winchester in her hands. Her hands were no longer shaking. As Rafe ran toward her, his face lit by the flames of the world he had tried to burn down. She was perfectly, terrifyingly calm. This was the man who had bought her, beaten her, and chained her. This was the ghost she had to exorcise herself. She raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel, and fired. The shot was clean, precise, and utterly cold. Rafe stopped in his tracks. A look of profound surprise crossed his face. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his chest, then back up at her. He fell to his knees, and then pitched forward into the snow, dead before he hit the ground. The world went silent, save for the crackle of the dying fires. Mr. Stinson and his son slowly lowered their weapons, staring at the carnage, at the still form of Rafe Conrad, and at the woman standing in the barn doorway, smoke and fury clinging to her like a shroud. Josie dropped the rifle and ran back to Elias. He was stirring, his eyes fluttering open. He looked up at her, his gaze unfocused. The world was still a blur of pain. "Don't let this be the end," he murmured, his voice a ragged whisper. She knelt beside him, taking his hand, her tears finally falling, washing paths through the soot and grime on her face. She looked down at this man who had tried to save her, this broken, decent man she had come to love. And in that moment, she knew she was no longer the one who needed saving. "It's only the beginning," she replied, her voice steady and clear above the crackling flames. "If you stop closing your eyes." Elias did not die in the snow. He clung to life by a thread, a stubborn, fraying strand that Josie refused to let snap. For 2 days and nights, he hovered in a gray world between life and death, lost in a fevered haze. Josie, with the help of the Stinsons, moved him into their farmhouse, a place of warmth and the clean scent of soap and baking bread. Mrs. Stinson, a woman whose face was a roadmap of hard winters and quiet kindness, showed Josie how to clean the wounds, how to boil willow bark for the fever, and how to spoon broth between his cracked lips. Josie tended to him with a fierce, unwavering focus. She did not sleep. She watched the shallow rise and fall of his chest, her hand often resting on his, willing her own strength into him. In his delirium, he spoke a name she had never heard him utter, a soft, broken whisper. Ellie. He would reach out with his good arm, searching for someone who wasn't there. Josie would take his hand and hold it, anchoring him to the living world, her heart aching with a sorrow she could not name but instinctively understood. The arrival of 2 United States Marshals a few days after the shootout was the first sign of the coming thaw. They were hard, quiet men who rode in from the territorial capital, summoned by a telegraph from a neighboring town about the lawlessness in Ash Valley. They looked at the burned-out cabin, the frozen bodies being buried in the town cemetery, and the bullet-riddled corpse of Rafe Conrad. They listened to Mr. Stinson's account. They listened to Josie's. She told them everything, her voice clear and steady, leaving out no detail of Rafe's cruelty or the sheriff's corruption. Sheriff Brody was removed from his office without fanfare. He was allowed to pack a bag and ride out of town, a disgraced man stripped of his gold watch and his authority. The marshals stayed for 2 weeks, their presence a cold, sobering wind that blew through the town. Rafe's thugs scattered, melting back into the mining camps from which they had come. A new sheriff was appointed, a grim-faced veteran of the war who had no ties to the mine or the saloons. For the first time, the law in Ash Valley felt like a shield for the weak, not a weapon for the strong. By the time the snow began its retreat, pulling back from the valley floor to reveal the muddy, hopeful earth beneath, Elias was on his feet. He was thin and pale, his left arm bound tightly to his chest, his side wrapped in clean bandages. But he was alive. The first day he was able to walk outside, he stood on the Stinsons' porch and looked out at the land, at the distant, blackened patch where his cabin had stood. Josie came to stand beside him. "They're gone," she said quietly. "All of them." He nodded, leaning against a porch post for support. He looked at her, at the dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes, and the fierce strength that had taken root there. "You saved me," he said, his voice still rough. "We saved each other," she corrected him softly. Spring arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a muddy, boisterous force of nature. The creek swelled with melted snow, and the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and new pine growth. The sound of hammers echoed through Ash Valley, but it was a different sound now, not of desperate prospecting, but of hopeful rebuilding. Elias and Josie did not rebuild on the ashes of the old cabin. With the help of the Stinsons and a few other quiet neighbors who had seen the truth of that bloody night, they staked a claim on a small parcel of land further up the valley, a piece of ground with a clear running stream and a stand of tall aspens. It was humble, forgotten land that no one else had wanted. To them, it was a kingdom. They worked from sunup to sundown. The labor was hard, a punishing, physical testament to their will to survive. Elias, his arm still healing, could only do so much, but he worked with a steady, relentless determination. He cleared stones from the earth, his good hand raw and blistered. Josie worked beside him, her hands, once soft, growing calloused and strong. They were a silent, efficient team. They felled trees and shaped the logs, raising the walls of a small, sturdy house, a home built not on dreams, but on the solid foundation of shared hardship. They did not speak of love. The word felt too small, too flimsy for the powerful. unbreakable thing that had grown between them. It was in the way she would bring him water without him having to ask, the way he would always take the heavier end of a log. It was in the shared silence at the end of the day, sitting on the unfinished porch, watching the stars prick the vast, dark canvas of the sky. Their life was a quiet, humble thing, but for the first time, it was entirely their own. Society, however, has a long memory. The town of Ash Valley, in its effort to become respectable, was quick to draw new lines of propriety. Josie was a reminder of a past they wanted to forget. She was the saloon girl, the woman who had lived with a man outside of marriage, the woman who had killed. When she walked into the general store, a chill would often follow her. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, and her circle of ladies would fall silent, their conversations resuming in pointed whispers only after Josie had passed. They saw the simple, homemade dress she wore, but in their minds, she was forever clad in the crimson satin of the lucky ribbon. They never spoke to her directly. They simply made her invisible, a ghost in their new, righteous town. Josie bore their scorn with a quiet, unbreachable dignity. It was a familiar weight, and it no longer had the power to break her. For every cold shoulder she received from the town's elite, there was a quiet kindness that mattered more. Mrs. Stinson would ride over with a basket of fresh eggs, her presence a warm, unspoken statement of solidarity. The children from the neighboring farms, untouched by their parents' prejudices, would bring her offerings of wildflowers. Their small, grubby hands held out in simple friendship. Travelers, stopping to water their horses at the creek, would see a woman of quiet strength and gentle kindness, and they would leave with a story of the small, resilient ranch at the edge of the valley. These were the people who mattered. Their acceptance was the soil in which Josie's new life took root. One evening in late summer, as the sun was setting, casting long, golden fingers of light across the valley, Elias came to her. She was standing by the small vegetable garden she had planted, her hands resting on the rough timber of the fence he had built. The air was warm and smelled of pine and the coming dusk. He stood beside her for a long moment, watching the last of the light fade from the high peaks. He seemed nervous, a rare thing for a man so defined by his stillness. He reached into the pocket of his worn trousers and pulled something out, holding it in his palm. "Josie," he began, his voice a little unsteady. "I ain't a man with much to offer. This land is poor, and I ain't got $1 to my name." He paused, taking a breath. "For 10 years, I've been walking, just walking, trying to outrun a memory, trying to pay a debt to a ghost. I built walls around myself so thick I didn't think anything could ever get through." He looked at her then, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, were full of a raw, vulnerable emotion she had never seen before. "Then I met you, and I saw you fighting. You fought this whole rotten world with nothing but your own stubborn pride. You never quit." He opened his hand. On his calloused palm lay a simple silver ring, worn thin with age. It was a small, unadorned band, a humble circle of light in the growing dark. "This was my sister's," he said, his voice thick. "Her name was Ellie. This is all I have left of her." The confession was a quiet earthquake, a final tearing down of the walls he had hidden behind for so long. "I used to think my life was a penance for not being there to save her. But you showed me that saving someone ain't about being strong enough to fight their battles. It's about being brave enough to stand with them while they fight their own." He looked from the ring to her face, his heart in his eyes. "You saved me from loneliness, Josie. Not with your body, but with your fight. You fought for your own life, and in doing so, you gave me back mine." He took her left hand, his touch infinitely gentle. "I know I don't deserve you, but I'm asking if you'll let me spend the rest of my life trying to—" Tears streamed silently down Josie's face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were a warm, cleansing rain, washing away the last of the dust and grime of her past. She could not speak. She simply nodded, a small, convulsive movement of her head. He slid the thin, worn silver ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. The final scene unfolded a few weeks later, on the day they were to be married by a traveling justice of the peace. It was a clear, crisp autumn afternoon. Josie stood in the doorway of their home, the home they had built with their own hands. She was looking out at the valley, at the aspen trees that were turning a brilliant, fiery gold. She was not wearing her simple calico dress. She was wearing the crimson dress from the saloon. She had spent a week mending it, her needle flying with meticulous care. She had repaired every tear, reinforced every seam. The color was a little faded, the fabric worn, but it was whole again. It was the dress she had let fall in shame at his feet in that cold, dark cabin. Today, she wore it like armor. It was a declaration. She was not ashamed of the woman who had worn this dress, of the woman who had danced for coins, of the woman who had survived. That woman was a part of her, a testament to the steel in her soul. Elias came up behind her. He did not speak. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. It was an embrace of comfort, of partnership, of absolute belonging. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his gaze following hers out over the golden valley, over their small, improbable kingdom. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, a small, contented smile on her lips. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her back. All the ghosts were gone. All the walls were down. There was only the quiet strength of his arms around her and the promise of a future, a life built not in spite of their scars, but because of them. "You can look now," she said, her voice a soft whisper on the autumn air. And he did. Thank you for listening to our story. We encourage you to comment where you are listening from so you can connect with others. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.